So anything to report from our last week's lesson? Anything, any fallout, any feedback? Okay then.
Well, I can never go into detail because it's not how my memory works, but I find that this practice overall has me being way more aware of every movement, every touch, every, posture. I'll just kind of wake up inside what I'm doing and think, what would Moshi say? What would Moshi do? So it's great. It's really great.
I agree, Stephanie. It's like, okay, how many ways can I do this? How can I do this move without hurting my foot? How can I do this move without hurting my knees?
Yeah. Well, theoretically, my skeleton's going to support me doing this. I wonder how that might happen.
Right, exactly. And that's wonderful. That's excellent, Stephanie, that you're becoming self-aware in more and more moments of your life, right? And isn't that, I mean, we're embodying ourselves. That's what the lessons are about, or really, how can we better embody ourselves in everything we do? And, because the body's always there. The body is always there in real time, but we are not always there in real time. It's that coming back to real time that is the thing. Christine is not here, but I don't think she would mind if I shared with you something she wrote to me after the last class, which I believe for some of you was miserable. But at any rate, it had to do with rotation and lifting knees and being on the stomach, which is not a pleasant situation for for most of us, I would say. But at any rate, after that difficult lesson, she has been injured for a long time. Her knees do not straighten all the way, and she relies on a scooter to get around to go grocery shopping, etc.
Oh, wow.
And has been unable to resolve this satisfactorily. But then last week, after that difficult lesson, she got up and spontaneously walked across the floor.
Oh.
And walked back and without any assistance. And it wasn't, her knees were not straight, and she felt that she was like leaning forward, but something had changed, and it was spontaneous. And those experiences are pretty fabulous when they happen. So it means that, something is happening in the nervous system, in the brain, and it's getting through to our functional selves. So I was excited to get that email. So today we're going to float.
Oh.
Today we're going to float. So could you come up onto your 2 feet, or not? Or not? Could come up onto 2 knees.
I can come up onto my knees.
Could come up onto 2 knees, yes. And starting with this idea of the skeleton that Stephanie spoke about, that our skeleton theoretically supports us. So how is your skeleton supporting you this morning? You can notice the weight on your feet. You can notice if you favor one leg over the other, that's fine. Don't try to correct or even things out. Just let yourself be what is in this moment, what your body is doing in this moment. Just all you have to do is pay attention. You can notice how your arms are hanging. You can notice how you're breathing. And with this idea of if we're floating, if we could if the skeleton could float, if you could float over your skeleton and shift your weight to the right and to the left in a way that you're floating over to the right and you're floating over to the left. You're floating over there. So sort of backing away from this idea that we must push the floor in order for something to happen, that you can simply, the skeleton can float lightly. You could even float a little tiny bit forward and back. Just a little bit, just a little bit. Not to the point where you feel insecure in any way and muscles start to hold on to save you, but just finding. And as you float forward and back, is there a tendency to go towards one foot one direction and the other foot the other? So might you be shifting forward and back on a diagonal? That's an interesting question. Into the forefoot of one side, into the heel of the other. Could you float in the opposite diagonal? If you were floating in a diagonal, could you float in the opposite diagonal? And what is that like? And then could you float in a way that your skeleton starts to describe, if you had a big pencil coming out the top of your head, and it reached the ceiling, that your whole skeleton moving would make that pencil would make a circle on the ceiling. It's like your whole spine is the pencil. And you can notice as you float around in a circular fashion where the circle is not round, where you might be shaving it off. And all you have to do is notice. We'll do the lesson and we'll see what happens. Could you float circularly in the other direction? In a way that's comfortable, in a way that doesn't interrupt your breathing, in a way that you feel secure. And then pause there on your feet and sense your floatiness. And then could you float your head to turn to the right and to the left in a way that it's floating very easily, so there's no sense of strain or density or muscular effort. It's just floating. The slipperiest substance in the universe is the synovial fluid, which covers our joints. And then could you please come onto your backs on the floor with whatever assistance you need to feel comfortable. If you can, have your legs long. We will be doing the lesson with the feet drawn up mostly, but if you can, have your legs long. And with the same sense of, usually we're paying attention to the weight of this side, the weight of that side. Can you sense your skeleton, or imagine your skeleton floating inside of you? We're 98% water, so your skeleton floating inside the casing of your body, inside the tissues and the muscles and the tendons and the skin. And you can, as you stay with this idea that you're floating, your skeleton is floating inside yourself. You can begin to notice, do the toes of one foot point more out to one side of the room than the other? Is the small of your back arching away from the floor a bit? And is there less space behind one side or the other? You can sense the neck floating away from the floor. And the head resting. And then could you float your legs so that the feet are standing on the floor? Could you float your legs so that your feet are standing on the floor? And the sacrum that's resting on the floor, which is the triangular bone connecting the two elephant ears of the pelvis, you're resting on your sacrum. But not really, because there's skin and there's tissues in between you and the floor. So could you begin to contact your sacrum in this internal sort of floaty way? And notice if it feels that it's more weighted, or if there's more of it on the floor on one side or the other. So if you go to the place that is not right and not left, that central place, not right and not left, and that might mean it's not in the center, but it's not right and it's not left. So you can distinguish right from left from this place. Is your sacrum engaged more with the floor on one side or the other of this place that we call center? And could you begin to float your sacrum a little to the right and a little to the left, which means that it will be rolling. It won't be sliding. You won't be lifting it. It's not that kind of levitation, but you're rolling the sacrum a little to the right, a little to the left, but it's in a very floaty way. So that the pelvis turning around the hip joints, it floats. You're floating around your hip joints. You can notice which side feels more accessible, easier, and listen to or continue floating to the right, a little to the right, a little to the left side of your sacrum until you feel that it feels quite even on the one side and the other. That there's a sense of balance between the right and the left. And the knees, they stay vertical to the ceiling. They stay vertical to the ceiling. So it's not a large movement. The feet are spread comfortably. The knees are spread comfortably. You might sense one knee seems to go further away from you than the other. There's something of a walking pattern in this movement. Maybe you can detect that. As the pressure through the feet changes, but it's not that you're pressing the foot into the floor. It's being weighted a bit by the movement of the pelvis, more on one side and then on the other. And how far through yourself towards your head, in the direction of your head, maybe not all the way to your head. But as you continue to float and turn the pelvis to the right and the left and float the sacrum, float over the sacrum. Listen to the floor behind you. Listen through the spine. Up through the chest and into the neck and the head. Is there any sense that the head might be floating a bit to the right and to the left? And then pause with that. Pause with that. And now can you begin to roll your pelvis towards and away from your head? This is a movement we've done hundreds, if not thousands of times. And we usually think of pushing the feet into the floor and listening to, is one foot pressing more than the other? So let's go ahead and do that, since that's what's familiar. That the feet can drive the pelvis or the sacrum to roll towards the head a bit. And then you do something with yourself that draws the weight towards the tail. So you're rolling over the sacrum there. And of course, you're using your back muscles to do that. We want to get anatomically technical about things. And you can notice if one foot presses more than the other. And then can you change your intention so that the sacrum is floating towards and away from the head, which means that the pelvis is rolling towards and away from the head, but that there's really no sense of it being driven by the feet. It's not driven by the feet. You might feel something transferring through the soles of the feet towards the heels as you float the sacrum towards the head, and then towards the feet, what happens in the soles of the feet. But it's not being driven by the feet. And can you imagine, or perhaps you can even sense, that the pelvis, the hip joints on the right and the left, there's a floating quality as the pelvis turns around the hip joints, going towards the head and going away. The pelvis turning around the hip joints, and it's floating over the hip joints. It's floating. And how do you breathe as you do this? Is your breath somehow part of this very light floating quality, that the air can just float into you and then float back out? And begin to notice that as you float towards the back of the waist, and as you float towards the tail, is there a sense that there might be more weight on one side or the other? So might you be, as the pelvis is rolling and the sacrum is floating under and the small of the back is coming closer to the floor, is there a sense that there might be more weight on one side of your ribs than the other? And then going the other way, might there be more weight on one side of the sacrum? So that your particular signature in this movement might be to be rolling a bit diagonally. We're not trying to straighten anything out. We're not trying to be perfectly in the middle. We're just noticing what is the natural tendency of your body right now, this place in this time. And get a clear sense of that image as you sense, as you feel, and as you act. Can you get a sense of an image of yourself moving in this plane? And does this move, do these forces, these ground forces that are rolling through you like a tide, where does the tide carry your head? What does it invite your head to do, if anything? Can you sync up your breathing with this? Floating. And then you can pause and maybe come to rest in some other position. So maybe onto your side, so that there's a different sense of support through the skeleton on the floor, just to refresh the senses. If you haven't fallen asleep. And now could you float back into this position of being on the back with the feet standing? And could you imagine in between your knees, you're holding a clock. And if you were to lift your head and look at the clock, well, you would see, 12 and 6 and 3 and 9, and 12 would be at the top and 6 at the bottom and 3 to the right and 9 to the left. And then if you were to float this clock underneath your pelvis, just have it float underneath your pelvis, so that 12 would be towards your feet and 6 would be towards your head. And could you begin to float your sacrum towards 12 and towards 6? Between 12 and between 6. So now we're directing with our intention that place that's neither right nor left. And again, we're not pushing with the feet, we're not pulling with the back. It's something else. It's something else. It's the sense of floating. So the movement is, well, all the movements today will be quite small. Will be quite small. But even though they're small, as you go towards 6, towards the head, can you feel the lower ribs expanding downwards towards the floor? As you go towards 12, towards the feet, and you float around the hip joints in a way that's very evenly distributed. Stay in that place that's neither right nor left. And as you continue to go between 12 and 6, sensing the tissues as you're coming all over the tissues of your back, that your spine starts to roll like a wave, coming more and more into contact with the floor, higher up. And then it floats back down. And listen to the relationship between the sacrum and your head. And might your head be responding to the pelvis, so that as you float towards 6, towards the head, that the back of the head is turning and floating in such a way that the chin is coming away from the chest a bit. And as the pelvis floats down towards the feet, towards 12, that the head floats sort of, if there were an equator around your skull, that the head is floating a little north and a little south of the equator. Where is the equator of your head? And that's the point on which you rest. And as the sacrum is floating towards and away from the head with no real help from the feet, that the head is floating north and south of the equator on which you rest. And always flowing in the background, you're breathing. And might you somehow, with your intention, change so that it's your breath that is the driver of the movement, and the head and the sacrum are passengers along the railway of the spine. Then could you come again to rest in a different position? Just, can you float over into that other position? It's a very different way of inhabiting ourselves, to think that we could float here and there. And could you come to float again onto your back? And float your head support underneath you if you need it. And have your legs long. Have your legs long. And sense your skeleton floating now again with the long legs. And from here, with your legs extended, could you float your sacrum towards 6 and towards 12? Float your sacrum towards 6 and towards 12, so that the lower back comes into contact. And where is this coming from? Where in your system can you spread this idea of floating evenly throughout all of your tissues? So that as you float the sacrum towards the head, is there a sense that somehow the backs of the knees participate? Somehow the heels participate and are drawn sort of towards you. And that this floating of the sacrum north and south could be somehow initiated from the heels, unless there's a reason for you not to do so. You could continue initiating from somewhere more centrally, but if you can initiate from the heels, this floating, which means the heels have to engage with the floor. And as they engage with the floor and you're going north, more space will appear under the knees, and you can notice, does the space appear symmetrically under the knees? Is the engagement of the heels the same on the right and on the left? Probably, maybe not. But to listen to how our habituated ways of using ourselves travels north, not just through the sacrum, but into the spine and into the ribs. And is there a deviation to the right or to the left? And really honoring that for a few moments as you float north and south, that I say, yes, you might float diagonally. But then what would it take to float the mirror image of that diagonal? Or somewhat. But sometimes when we start trying to make things even, things start working harder on one side. So we want to keep this idea of floating consistent throughout the lesson. We don't start grabbing and pushing and insisting, but just using the mind. It's really the imagination that is, you keep the picture in the mind. The imagination is insisting, can you try something different? It's laying down the roadmap. So it's our thinking and our sensing and our feedback from the floor and our actions, all these things, an interplay. Sensing and feeling and thinking and acting. And giving yourself time to make adjustments. To think. To sense. As you act and afterwards, what is the result? Could your back somehow engage with the floor, along with your heels, along with your sacrum, in a way that floats your skeleton towards your head, like a wave of water rushing through you? And the head being sort of rolled north and south of your equator, and float to rest in a different position. If you are still awake or not. This is how I know who's still here. I'll be right back. Notice if you rolled to your side, which side you chose. Can you float onto the other side? Can you float, just float onto the other side until you feel support, and then you can rest there on that support. And then could you, oh, we have some nice lava happening over here. Yes, maybe lava is a nice image for some of you, but could you float to the right and float to the left? And really taking all the time you need. Just if you want to insist on anything, insist on not losing the quality of floating until you feel a place to rest and sink. And remember that we've talked about this before, that resting is not abandoning yourself to the floor or abdicating. It's a sense of alert, relaxed alertness, a confident readiness in your system. And you can notice as you float from one side to the other, maybe going all the way to one side is not such a great idea for you today. Maybe you're getting some pushback from your neck or your shoulder or I don't know where, but so you honor that and you just float as much as is comfortable, and then you come back. You don't have to float all the way from side to side. Take all the time you need, make all the adjustments you need to stay with this sense of complete lightness, fluidity. And you can just take notes along the way how one side may feel quite different than the other. How the limbs arrange themselves, how the arms come with you from one side to the other. But as long as you're keeping it comfortable and a sense of evenness. And so you are being rocked in a boat on the water with your skeleton floating inside of you. And then the next time you pass to you're on your back, go ahead and stay. Stay on your back and lengthen your legs and listen to your skeleton floating inside. And can you float your feet to standing, one after the other, just lightly, lightly. And then go back to floating your sacrum, north and south. And can you add Another element, some of you may have been in class when we did this before, there's the imagine that there's someone sitting at your feet and they reach between your legs with their fists and they place their fists on your sits bones, those bony protuberances on which we sit. And as you float your sacrum north, as your head floats over the equator to the north, someone is pushing through your sits bones, pushing through your sits bones so that there's a sense of your spine being driven like a piston through your center. And then they release the pressure and you float, and the pelvis floats back towards the feet. The small of the back comes away from the floor a bit more. But now as you continue this imagined pressure through the sits bones from these imaginary fists, listen to the spine and listen to this is very subtle. As the sacrum is floating north and the small of the back is coming closer to the floor and the spine is being pressed like a piston through you, there is a sense that the head begins to slide, the skull begins to slide ever so slightly upwards and the chin comes a little bit downwards. That this pressure, this lengthening of the lower back starts to create a lengthening in the back of the neck. And then as you float the pelvis, as you float the sacrum towards the tail, there's an opposite sort of pulling of the skin and floating of the occiput over the atlas, that the chin can come away from the throat as the tail comes closer to the floor. So play with this. The head is now going opposite of what we normally do, but it's because of our interaction with the floor and these imaginary fists. That there's a sense of you growing taller, the spine going through you, passing through, and inviting the back of the neck to lengthen. As the lower back lengthens, and the spine becomes straighter in those curves behind the neck, behind the lower back, but keeping this idea of floating and an outside force pressing. And think of that place that's neither right nor left. And hold that as an idea in your mind. This is lovely. This is lovely. Pause from that, but continue to float as you're resting. And sense the position of your skeleton. Sense the support that your bones take from the floor without you having to do anything. And could you float yourself up onto your feet or onto your knees? Continue floating. You can go back to your evil ways in a few minutes, but continue floating. Continue floating. And sense. And think. And feel. And if you were to float around in this circle again that we did at the beginning, around the feet, the top of the head, a giant pencil through your center. You're floating. The skeleton is floating inside of you. How is this circle now? Can you float the other direction? And then simply float forward and back. And float one side to the other. Is it different? Does something change? And then if you were to float, and sometimes you might just enjoy this floating from one side to the other, or you can float about your environment. Could you walk and maintain this sense of floating? Or maybe just the idea of taking a step without losing this sense of floating. The skeleton is there to support you. The steps don't have to be big. They don't have to be forward. They could be sidewards, they could be backwards. But you're floating. What is your sense of yourself? Your sense of well-being? Your sense of calm and of confidence? And if you'd like to stay a bit and share how this was for you, you can do that, or if you'd like to float away.